Hi, I'm Nathan. I'm going to talk about my main work, the Clone Assembler, and in order to have any of what I'm about to talk about make any sense, I'm also going to introduce a little bit of the background of computer simulation of molecules. What that entails. Next page, please. Okay, so a little bit about me. I'm a PhD student. I got my bachelor's degree from the University of Kansas in 2014, and I started a PhD program in computer science here in 2017, and I don't even know why I put this here. I have no idea what I'm actually going to graduate. This is hopefully accurate, but this is what I've been putting on my past 4 annual reviews. If it'll actually happen. So anyway, so that's me. Obviously, this is my advisor, Dr. Wangla Im. This is Jamin, who's been helping me a lot on my work and things that I care about. A lot of video games, thanks to Lars a lot. I also really love Subnautica, and generally any game that has like an economy or crafting in it will make me very happy. I also play chess. I don't usually play against people because long games are kind of a commitment. When I do play against people, my rating is not anywhere near this. It's more like 1400, so don't take that super seriously. Obviously, I like computers, otherwise I wouldn't be doing a PhD program in computer science, and I like chemistry. So I got into computational biology and or bioinformatics because I wanted to have some way of combining those two interests together into something, and this allows me to do that. So here are the things I'm going to be talking about today. I'm going to start with 3 types of introduction, and then talk about what molecular dynamics simulation is. Very, very little about the theory of how they're able to do it at all. And then I'm going to give some background in the kinds of problems that arise when you try to build a molecular model that you want to simulate. And then my work, which is supposed to make the model building part a little easier. So as for molecular dynamics, there are actually many different types of molecular simulations that you can do that differ mainly on the scale of things that you're trying to simulate. So I stole this image here from a journal article right here in et al. Because I like the way that it kind of shows you the different scales. It's very subjective, I guess, the scales that they're using here. So you notice that there are 2 y-axes, no x-axes, which is confusing. But instead of an x-axis, we have these different categories. And the way that you should think about this is basically for certain types of models, the higher up the model is on here, the smaller the simulation timescale that you can get, and the smaller the model that you can get. If you want bigger models, then you either would spend a very long time simulating something, or you should switch to a type of model that has a faster computation. And so there's always going to be this trade-off that you're making between precision of your simulation, meaning basically how accurate it is to real life as far as we know. The most accurate thing is going to be using quantum. So this is using wave functions to calculate everything. But the work that I do is mostly at what we call the all-atom model. So instead of wave functions, we just have a single point that corresponds to an atom, and every atom has a point or particle that it corresponds to, hence the name all-atom. But if you want to get even faster simulations at or bigger models, then you can use something called a coarse-grained model. And what unifies all of these is essentially, instead of 1 particle per atom, you might have 1 particle for a group of atoms, usually a functional. So I am curious, people in this audience, how many of you have any kind of bio or chemistry background at all? Okay, most of you, that's good. How many of you have maybe a computing or engineering background? Okay, I'm curious what these people in the back are doing, but hopefully I don't bore you to death. All right, anyway, so there are different models that you can use that use like larger and larger particles, and this makes the whole thing less precise, but you can get longer timescales. But the main thing that you should notice is that both of these scales here are extremely small compared to the kinds of numbers that we deal with in real life. a picosecond, that's, I put these numbers, this wasn't in the original figure here for some scale here. This is 10 to the minus 12 seconds, right? And angstrom is actually pretty close to that in terms of meters. So like in all atom simulations, the longest simulations that you'll typically get are going to be on the order of microseconds, which means you're trying to study some sort of physical phenomenon, and it takes more than a microsecond for that phenomenon to happen in real life. You won't observe it in a simulation. So that's going to be something that would cause you to decide not to do this. However, well, I'll talk more about the trade-off in a moment, but to sort of tease you a little, here's what it looks like sometimes when you choose to actually make a video out of your simulation. Normally, we don't do this because it actually takes a lot of computational power to render something like this. We just take cute little parts. But here's a very simple simulation that I did recently for my project, where I just have two types of molecules. One is water. Everybody knows water. One is toluene. Less of you would know toluene, but basically it's a molecule that's not very water soluble. It's kind of oily. And so I started the simulation with all the atoms evenly mixed. So this is using a type of representation called the surface representation. So this is an all atom simulation. There are atoms in here, but you can't see the atoms. Instead, we're looking at the surface that's defined by the contour of the whole molecule. So initially, all evenly mixed, and the toluene is the cyan stuff, and the transparent part is the water. I don't know how well this is showing up for our virtual participants. I know that sometimes the frame rate is a bit of an issue, but basically what you should notice, and even for virtual participants, is that although I started with it evenly mixed, everything very quickly coalesced into just a small number of larger blobs of toluene. Yes. So stop it right there. Some quick facts about this. I want to go to right here. So little important things here because of the way that we define our simulations. There is no such thing as the edge of the system. Really, this part looks like it's a different blob than this, but they're actually the same one, because on the other side of this part that I'm not showing is actually another copy of this part. So this is really one. So basically what I see is two big blobs and a bunch of little tiny ones interspersed. So about this, the actual length of the simulation that I showed in this video is 20 nanoseconds. I am using a simulation time step, which I'm going to talk about in a little bit, but basically every frame of what's actually being simulated is 4 femtoseconds. That might not be minus 12. They might actually be minus 15. I think minus 12 is picoseconds. But anyway, the time step is extremely small, and I'll talk about that again in a bit. The total number of actual steps of simulation in order to get 20 nanoseconds was 5 million. There are 300,000 atoms. The size of this cube is 15 nanometers. And the actual frames of the video that I'm showing you are 1 frame per 100 picoseconds of simulation. So why then would you even use simulations if you can only get such small timescales? Well, probably the most important reason is that while the length of time is very small, you get all of the information that you want about what happens during that time. You know the location, you know the velocity of every particle in your simulation. And actually in quantum mechanics, that would be literally impossible according to the Heisenberg uncertainty principle. You can't know both of those things with absolute certainty, but because we cheat by simulating it, we do know those things. We can detect changes that occur across very small time scales, and we can study molecular systems that are basically impossible to study in real life because maybe the molecules are really expensive to isolate, or we just don't know how to get the thing. So if we can build a computer model for the thing, and we can't build an experiment for the thing, then simulation is literally the only thing we have. The fact that you get access to all the location and velocity sometimes makes the results that you get from simulation easier to interpret than you have an experiment. You can precisely control the behavior of things, even causing them to do unrealistic things if you want them to see what happens when you perturb the system. The cons of simulation are basically, well, you're using a program to do simulation, and how valid your results are depends on how accurate that program is, right? So that matters, and those programs are using something called the force field that I'm going to talk about in a little bit. It's not Star Wars, it's a little bit different. And because we have to create our force field and update it from time to time, we sometimes have to spend a lot of time checking whether the thing that we built a computer model of is actually correct, which usually means that we have to compare it to experiment. And again, the short time steps means you can't be studying things that happen over the course of hours or days. And the data usage also restricts you to very small systems. So a gigabyte of memory, most of your computers are going to be having at most a few terabytes. So a gigabyte is a billion bytes. A terabyte is a trillion bytes. The number of bytes, if we give the very generous assumption that it's just 1 byte per particle, just to model the system. If you want to model a single liter of water, you would need 32 million billion bytes, which is, I'm pretty sure, way more data than we currently have storage capacity for on the entire planet. So you have to think small if you're going to study molecules with a simulation. Okay, so that was a little teaser. So I'm going to try to very briefly cover the theory of how it works. I promise I'm not going to go in depth. So here is a simplified version of the formula, or the algorithm rather. So you start the simulation by having coordinates and velocity for every single particle. You use those coordinates and your force field, which I'm going to talk about in the next slide, to calculate what is the force that is happening on every particle in your system. You use those forces to update the acceleration and the position of all of your atoms. And then once you do that, you move them and you recalculate the forces and repeat the process however many times you need. So I'm not going to go a whole lot into what's going on in this equation, but you're moving the atoms and you're using the current velocity, its current position, its acceleration, and delta t, which is the size of your time step, in order to figure out essentially how far it moves in the direction of where the current forces want it to move. And experimentally, we know that in order for you to get actually accurate, valid results, this time step has to be close to a few femtoseconds, just again 10 to the minus 15, in order to get good results. So that's the thing that's restricting our ability to get long timescales. So now I've mentioned this term force field a lot, so I should probably explain what the heck a force field is. So the force field is a function that considers a whole bunch of different energy terms in order to output an energy or a force given just the position of everything. So there are a lot of terms here. This is the simplified version telling you what each little chunk here represents. So you have one term that represents energy that comes from atoms being bonded to each other. You have energy that comes from atoms that are not bonded to each other. So that can be further broken down into the bonds itself, angles, actually, so okay. Bond energy. So bond energy looks like this. This is using this term right here in the expanded equation. So if any of you have done engineering, you might recognize this as the expression for a harmonic oscillator. But basically what that means is that we pretend that a bond between two atoms is just an idealized spring. So just a whole bunch of little springs. But in order for that to actually work, we also have to create new types of springs, essentially. So we also imagine an angle made by 3 atoms as having a spring, but where instead of the distance between 2 things as being the thing that oscillates, it's the angle made by the 3 atoms that oscillates. You make another one where it's 4 atoms, and this is called the dihedral energy, and it represents the twist made by the middle bond of 4 atoms. And then we have these 2 non-bonded terms, one of which is the van der Waals force, which only the chemistry people are going to even remotely appreciate, and then electrostatic force, which is just the energy coming from the attraction and repulsion of things that have differing or the same electric charge. So all of these things are taken into account, charge, what's bonded to what, and where everything is located, when determining what force is acting on every part. Next. Okay, so that was the quick version of the theory of how simulation works. Now I'm going to talk about how you actually build models just a little bit. So as I said at the beginning, you have to know the position of every single atom in your system before you can simulate it. And this turns out to be just by itself a problem. So, but anyway, that's next. So, gotta know the exact number of each molecule. You have to have a force field that describes behavior of each molecule. Meaning, go back here. You need to know the actual energy that comes from whatever new molecule you have all of its bonds, the angles and dihedrals that it can make, and you also need to know the electric interactions and what electric is this one, and the van der Waals interactions it has, in order to fill in these numbers. And believe it or not, we actually don't know what numbers are appropriate to use for many molecules, but this system has been around long enough that a lot of them we do know. So you also need to know, number and type of each molecule. You need to know how big the molecular system is that you're trying to model. So the one that I showed in the video is 15.4 nanometers in terms of its cubic side length. And as I said, each atom needs to have an initial position. And that position can't just be totally random. One, it has to have each molecule taking a shape that it would normally take. It should also be one that avoids collisions. So if you have one water molecule, another water molecule, and you totally superimpose them, that's going to create really, really high energies because they don't want to do that. And then those high energies, if you were to actually start a simulation, cause the particles to fly off in opposite directions so fast that the computer can't keep up with it. So instead, to prevent that from happening, we have to come up with collision-free initial positions, or at least mostly collision-free. And because real systems don't just have huge amounts of vacuum between all of the molecules, then you should also make sure that the density at which things are packed is close enough to reality. And as I said, the molecules should not have a wonky shape. So people did used to do this all manually, and as we started trying to build models with more than 1,000 atoms, it became clear that it was a little bit too difficult to do by yourself. It would just be your own PhD project, with just be building one such model. So instead, we have lots of different tools that you can use to help automate the process of building these models. One web infrastructure that exists, which is the one that I work with, is called CharmGUI. A good chunk of the people here already heard that term before, which is good for you guys, but for everybody else, it is a website that has a whole bunch of different modules that you can use to build different aspects of your molecular model or build different types of models. So for coming up with the force field for molecules, we have this nice module called Ligand Reader and Modeler, where the most common use case would be you know the chemical formula for some molecule, or you know what it looks like when you draw it. You can literally draw it, and then it'll come up with the force field for you, provided that it's not too weird of a molecule. And then given one molecule of interest, like a protein or something, that you expect to be surrounded by water, then we can build a system where it's just that one protein or one protein complex is surrounded by water. If instead you have a membrane protein, then we can also build the membrane around your module, around your molecule. And here's examples of what it looks like when we build a solution or a membrane system. So here's a DNA helicase molecule. That's the yellow part with attached DNA and a bunch of ions. This is potassium and chlorine, I believe. And I hid the water for clarity, because otherwise it would just be one big block of water if I was showing that. And then here's an example of a membrane system that you can build with charm buoy. This is a membrane where each different type of lipid has a different color. And there's one protein here, shown here, and it's got, okay, this is a little hard to see because the colors are similar. But right here, there's this thing called the GPI link, which is just a bunch of atoms that actually cause this molecule to be chemically bonded to something inside the membrane that keeps it from floating away from the membrane. It's called the GPI link. So there are, in fact, other tools that can help you build molecular models for simulation. And I'm aware of very few that actually do all of the steps that Charm-Buoy does. So there are different software packages that can help you prepare force fields. Others that can do the solvation and membrane building process that I mentioned previously. And for more complex systems like a multi-component assembler builds, there's also this program called PackMol, another one called CellPack, that will just let you pack a whole bunch of molecules into some predefined region. But all of these things are basically tackling just one step of the problem. So once you have your force field, you need to do something with that force field to build a molecular system out of it. You need to have the force fields before you can do the solvation. And then you need to have the input program settings for whatever simulation program you're using. You have to tell it what temperature and all these things, and it needs to be in a particular format for that program. And so what that all works around to being is that you need to do a whole lot of effort, special effort, in order to get any kind of system built. So Charm-Buoy at least attempts to do all the steps of these things on one single infrastructure. And so I mentioned PackMol and CellPack. So those are like multi-component assembler modules, programs that can take a whole bunch of different molecules, as long as you know how many of them you want and what shape you want them, the system to be. It can come up with a way of packing all these molecules together in a way that avoids collisions, and can be used for simulation. So yes, so I'm going to talk about how my work, multi-component assembler, accomplishes that. So goals of multi-component assembler are essentially where you can give me any type of structure, molecular structure, and tell me how many copies of everything you want and how big the system is, and then it should come up with, goal is it should come up with a reasonable configuration for all of those molecules, so that you can run the simulation. And it'll also give you the files that you need to actually run the simulation. So you should ideally have it to the point where you can just hit a button and make the simulation go. Not quite there, but we're very close to it. So here's an example of what I mean by a complex system with many different components in it. So here's an example that I made in order to demonstrate heterogeneity of molecular systems that you could build. So this wavy stuff on the outside, this is water that I'm showing as a transparent surface. The brown stuff and the gray stuff is membrane lipids. This yellow and blue parts here are membrane proteins. We have solution proteins on the outside here. I also have this small gold nanoparticle on the inside, and all these things are provided in a collision-free placement. So in multi-component assembler, there are some important concepts that you use. Position that it's going to come up with is going to depend on what kind of molecule or molecular complex you're talking about. So if something should be located in the solvated region, so that's basically everything that's not inside of a membrane, then it's solvated. So this could be protein that's in the solution. There's a nanoparticle that would be in the solution, or it could be an example of a solvent molecule. So this would be like water, but not water. An ion is a small molecule that has a charge. A membrane molecule would be something located inside of the membrane. And then a periodic, XY periodic, is going to be something that spans and defines the X and Y dimensions of the system. So here's a hydroxyapatite. Hydroxyapatite is the material that's used to make teeth. And it's just a sheet of this. And here's a membrane that was shown in my initial slide. It does the same thing. Right, and so you have solvated region where these solvated things go, and then you have the membrane region. And so these three types of components would be placed somewhere in the solvated region. And then these kinds of components would be placed in the membrane region. Oh, okay. That was supposed to be my explanation earlier. So solvated components could include also ions or solvents. And I'll talk about the difference between these things in the way that multi-component assembler treats them in a moment. But basically, the way that multi-component assembler treats anything that you claim to be solvated is it just places a copy of the thing, and then it places a copy of all of the things that you want, which are called solvated, and then it finds ways to move them around that will reduce the collisions. An ion is going to be only the small ionic, small charged molecules, and this one can be placed in the same way, or it can be placed in a way where it will first come up with a random position for things and then calculate the energy of that position and try to minimize the energy by picking different locations and seeing which one has the lowest energy. Okay, a solvent is a small molecule that makes up the solvated region. And the thing about packing this molecule that can make things take a very long time on your computer is that if you actually need to place every single one individually, it can take many hours. Whereas solvents tend to be pretty regular. Let me put it this way. You could just pack a small version of the thing and then copy that small thing a bunch of times in order to fill up your solvent space. And that's how I do it in multi-component assembler in order to make that faster. Then membrane molecules, so this is not membrane, but something located inside of the membrane, are going to be placed in this region during packing process. Whereas if you have some kind of periodic slab-like material, then it would be placed, instead of being placed in the membrane region, we're calling it the membrane region instead. It is the membrane. You can use an actual membrane here, or you can use something membrane-like in its shape. Okay, so the steps that this program is using is we first read the Psf is the structure and Crt is the coordinates. So structure just means a list of the connectivity of all of your atoms. It's just a definition of your molecules. And you read the coordinates, but only for one copy of each molecule. And then you determine how big everything should be. And then you, well, not you, the multi-component assembler takes that information and comes up with a packing that is collision-free. And if you have a membrane and you need to build it, then we will build the membrane for you. And then if you have solvent, then we will build that. And then we will combine all three of these things, which were built separately, into one system and generate the simulation input parameters that you can use to run your simulation. So it's supposed to be with the colors. Oh, well. Okay, so what it looks like in terms of each step. So for the uploading of the Psf and Crt files, you literally just drag them and drop them into this form on the website, and then it handles reading them to figure out what kind of molecule it is, how big the molecules, and all that stuff. So here's a demo of three example molecules that would be located in the solution region, and some examples of the things that it's calculating about each of these molecules. So the volume of it versus the solvent accessible volume. So here's, if you can see, there's a tiny inner sphere here that represents the idealized spherical volume of this whole molecule if the whole thing were packed into one sphere. This outer sphere here is representing what we call the solvent accessible area, which is just like if you tried to make a shell of water, one water atom thick, one water molecule thick around the whole thing, that's how much space it would take up, is this outer sphere. And you do that for all of the different molecules that you upload, and you also calculate the charge of the molecule. And this is something that I would have provided more people who are actually trying to use Charangui right now. But since we're not trying to do that, basically, I came up with this system to make it so where if you don't actually know the exact number of molecules, as you commonly don't, but you know the density of the molecules instead, then you provide a number which represents the density of things, and then it will calculate for you how many molecules that corresponds to. So here's an example where you wanted 16% of the volume of your system to be taken up by proteins, for example. And then it will figure out, okay, well, that corresponds to one of each in this particular case. Right. I already explained solvent accessible volume, but that's further explained in this slide. So a water molecule is 1.4 angstroms thick. So this is a one molecule thick shell around the volume of your molecule. And in the case of membrane molecules, it is a little bit more complicated because some of the volume of your molecule is not actually located in the solution. So this part shouldn't contribute to the volume calculation for how much it takes up the solution. So it isn't. In any case, all of that information is used in order to come up with a very coarse-grained model that we use to initially pack your system. So what that looks like might be like this. So each color represents a different type of molecule in your solution. So I have 3 different proteins here, colored differently. So green, cyan, and orange. And they're placed initially randomly. And then we run a short simulation using this was a video. Oh, well, we run a short simulation where these little spheres are allowed to repel each other in order to hope that the initial position is relatively collision-free. That part. And then for molecules that are located inside of a membrane, instead of doing this part with all of the atoms, instead reduce it to 3 atoms. So one part just represents everything that's above the membrane, one part represents everything inside of the membrane, and another part represents everything below the membrane. And if your molecule happens to only have a part inside and above, then it would only be 2 parts. So up to 3 really large atoms is how we're faking this thing originally, versus 1 atom for the entire molecule here. Okay, and grad students care about this, you guys will. So basically, what I'm talking about when I say I pack these very large atoms that approximate the molecule, this is kind of what it looks like. So the box, as shown here, is the primary system. This is actually copied in every direction so that the effect is when a molecule leaves the edge, it seems to appear on the opposite side. When I showed you guys the water and toluene mixture video before, I said that I was hiding the nearby copies, right? So this is what it looks like if you show the whole thing. But anyway, so I have 2 different types of membrane proteins, and they're allowed to move within the membrane region, but the orientation that they have with respect to the membrane is kept consistent. So then wherever those molecules land at the end of this simplified simulation, we're going to start replacing them with a fully atomistic model. So got this one particle, for example, and then you take your coordinates that correspond to the actual molecule, you move them to where that big molecule was, delete the one big particle, and then start from there like that. And then skip that part. Talk about placement works. Oh, okay, yes, it is talked on this slide. So as I said, you replace the spheres with the fully all atom model, and then basically I just translate, meaning move. Well, first I check, are there collisions between this molecule and any nearby molecule? And if there are, then I move it slightly in every direction to see if any of those have less collisions. And I also rotate it slightly to try and find a combination of movement and rotation that minimizes the number of collisions. And I do this for every single molecule, and I repeat the process until basically until there are no more collisions. Sometimes it happens that you can't find a configuration that has no collisions, which is unfortunate, but actually this usually works. If the system is possible to pack, then it will usually find something. Yes, that part you guys don't care. When it comes to, okay, so this was packing solution molecules or solvated molecules, solvated or membrane molecules. For packing the solvent molecules, then generally the kind of information that people know if they're trying to build this model is they're not going to know, like, I need exactly 1,200 molecules of water in this system. Instead, they're going to know I need enough water to fill up a box this size. And they're going to know that the density of water at the temperature that I'm trying to simulate is this much. So instead of asking the user to provide the exact number, they provide the density. And if they have more than one solvent, then I also ask them to provide the ratio of the different solvents. And that's just the slide about what volume ratio is. I'm going to skip. So here are examples of solvents. Water is a solvent, that's not shown here, but toluene is a solvent, ethanol is a solvent. And here's an example of how I would build a large box that contains very densely packed ethanol and toluene as your mixed solvent. So I would start by building a very small version of the box that you have. So I pack these molecules by just placing them randomly and then moving and rotating them like I do with the large molecules to find some position, some configuration that has no collisions. And once I find one that has no collisions, then I copy this box as many times as necessary to fill up the whole full box size that you're trying to create. So that means that essentially I've reduced the problem of trying to pack this many molecules into the problem of packing this many molecules, which is what makes it go faster than it otherwise would. Okay. Not going to talk about ions, that'll take too long. But there are a lot of different types of ions, and you can position them in your system. It's actually very easy to do, but I think you guys will care more about what it looks like when it's actually built. So here's an example of something, a box containing a bunch of different solvents and also some ions. So there's potassium, I think that's the orange ones. There's chlorine, which I think is the purple ones. I'm showing the oxygen atom of water as this cyan ball here. And then the gray stuff is in butanol, and then the yellow stuff is toluene. So here's, yeah, so this system was built using the procedure that I just described. You know, pack a small version of all the solvents, copy it up to the full box size, and position ions within here. Ions are usually very easy to pack because most of them have only like one atom, so you just find a space, put it in. And it's evenly distributed. Okay, a slightly more complex example that you can build with multi-component assembler. So here's one type of protein called ubiquitin, which I'm showing in a surface model, which in this surface model just looks like a big blob. Okay, but I wanted to create a system that has this protein in a very high density. So this is a 25 volume percent density. And I also placed ions in this region, and some of these ions have more than one atom in them. And multi-component assembler is able to build this system in about 5 minutes. Okay. Here is a system that multi-component assembler builds that contains water and ethanol in an even mixture. So it looks like it's actually ethanol, then water, then ethanol, but because, as I've said, the system is copied in every direction, then if I were to go up from this, there would be more ethanol on the other side. So it has the effect of having one layer of water and one layer of ethanol. Here's another one that uses what I have called on previous slides a periodic material. So this is a slab of plastic called polyethylene terephthalate, or PET. Is actually like #1 plastic, I think, if you guys recycle. And I also have carbon dioxide shown here. So the point of this study, which I'm still trying to simulate this system actually, is to see if I can capture the effect of this plastic being able to keep carbon dioxide from going through it, essentially. This is supposed to be a plastic that's good at preventing that from happening. But the process of building it in multi-component assembler was very simple. You uploaded this thing, and then you uploaded a single copy of carbon dioxide. You said what the density of carbon dioxide was, and then it took care of the rest. Okay, here's another example that my advisor wanted me to build. So it's maybe hard to see, but there's one protein which is represented by these ribbons here. One protein surrounded by a whole bunch of different small molecules, but they're basically molecules that consist of like one functional group. And people who do drug design like to do these kinds of studies in order to try and guess what kind of drug compound might work to work with this protein if they want to inhibit its action or something like that. So yes, this has a volume fraction of, I think, 20% of these drug molecules. It's the acetyl coenzyme A. I don't know where it is, but there was also, this molecule has it does something with acetyl coenzyme A, so I included a few copies of that as well. So, but the point is, to build this system in multi-component assembler, you provided one copy of each of these molecules, ethanol, acetamide, phenoxide, polyethylene, and one copy of each of these three, and then specify the ratio of these things with respect to each other, and then you hit the next button, and then it packs them together. Okay, so that is my presentation, and believe it or not, I took less time than I thought I was going to take. So hopefully I didn't put all of you to sleep, but are there any questions about what I've just discussed? Yes.
I have a question. When you're talking about like collision, like does that mean the molecules can't touch in the system or just can't be like superimposed?
Good question. So if I just turn this
There's
on.
like a
So we could have, here's right, so I gave an extreme example of superfluous, right? That would be like another molecule of water, right? Right, like this. But actually, the way that we define a collision is
Do they see it on the data, the credits and?
let me see. So if I rank it all the way to the side, but I can use it. Yeah. Maybe it needs to be zoomed in. There's RNA as it comes. So this is superposed. We definitely want to avoid this, but the way that we actually define collisions is if they're touching, essentially. We define touching as being within, so oxygen has this size, nitrogen has this size. We would formally define touching as being like this, right? Right, so this is the size of the oxygen, this is the size of the oxygen. These two things touch, and so therefore they're colliding. In practice, though, actually, I just treat all atoms as though they're the same size. So it's more like this, and then those things are touching. So it's just if the distance between this and this is less than a certain number, then I say they're colliding.
So then if you can't have that in the system, how would you measure like molecules interacting?
Well, okay, so people online say something in chat. People online, can you even hear me at all if I'm all the way over here? Everybody's responding. So I'm going to assume that that means that they are, okay, one person says yes. That's good. Good, yay. Okay, so the question was, if things are not touching, then can they interact? And the answer is yes. And the reason for that is that actually most of the interactions can go long range compared to the size of the molecule. So charge, for example, water, just like this. The water has an oxygen, which is relatively speaking negatively charged, and these things, which are relatively positively charged. The total charge of this whole molecule is neutral, so it says charge is 0, but this side tends to be more negative than this side. And so if you have another water molecule that's over here and it's not touching, even though it's not touching, these two negative parts will repel each other, so that if you just had a system containing just two molecules of water, this thing would want to rotate so that the positive part is closer to the negative part. That makes sense? So you have more dense systems with a whole lot of molecules, and it's taking all of the molecules' charges into account. And yes, so that's not the only force that's acting on long ranges, but it's the strongest force that's doing it. Anything else? Yes.
Could you reiterate how simulations work around the Heisenberg principle, uncertainty principle?
Well, we do it by cheating. So Heisenberg uncertainty principle says that you cannot know both the position and the velocity of the particle. That's partly because they're not really particles. They're wave functions that describe the probability, at least by one interpretation, the probability of something being in that location the moment it has to interact with something. But what we do in the all atom modeling is we cheat by telling them that they are particles, whether they want to be or not. So we just have a single point that we say that that's my oxygen atom or whatever. And in order to mimic the effect of electron orbitals, and the effects that have on like determining the shape of a molecule, we actually run simulations using the quantum mechanical model, but just the one molecule that we're trying to figure out what its shape should be or something, or just that one molecule and like a few surrounding ones. And so what that would look like for water, like drawing that one, is we would find through the quantum mechanical simulation that the oxygen and the hydrogen want to be in this sort of bent shape. And so we would come up with parameters that make it so that the distance between here and here is allowed to oscillate, because it is allowed to oscillate in a quantum mechanical style. But it's going to oscillate around some equilibrium length like this. So it might get longer at one point in the simulation, it might get shorter. Okay? But when it gets shorter, then it should be trying to get longer again. When it gets longer, it should be trying to get shorter again. So it kind of bounces around like this. For the angles, we would get from our quantum mechanical simulations that they want to have some kind of angle as opposed to this. And so that angle is allowed to oscillate as well, but more deviates from it, or the force that pushes it back to that angle. And dihedrals, which require a larger molecule in order to have. But here's an example of a ethane. We have the dihedral. The dihedral is I described it as a twist between the middle bond of 4 atoms. So here's an example of 4 atoms that are all bonded in a sequence. So that would be modifying the twist of this part. This is getting into some more chemistry stuff, but if you rotate this view like this, then you would see carbon right here. We would have a hydrogen here, here, and here. And then if we imagine I just drew this part right here, but then behind it, there's another carbon atom, and it has hydrogens sticking out of it like this. And experimentally, and also through quantum mechanical simulations, we know that this is the overall arrangement that the hydrogen atoms like to have in this kind of molecule. So they like to be where they're kind of staggered like this. So it's really hard to see. I'll draw out the really thick ones as being the ones that are attached to the closer carbon, and the thin ones are the ones attached to the farther away carbon. So staggered, low energy, it can be where that they are all lining up. This would look that they're all lined up. You can have that, but it has higher energy. So there's a function that I showed on. There's a function right here that basically treats it as some kind of a cosine wave that models this behavior of it being allowed to go into the lined up view, but preferring the staggered view. So, but the point is that with this equation, which now because the screen is hidden, now only the people online can actually see what I'm talking about. But yes, point is that for all these terms in the equation, the terms are come up with by whatever reproduces what we can experimentally see or what we can simulate with the quantum mechanical approach. But otherwise, we give every one of these things in actual position. It's just whatever precision the computer allows. That's how much we know about its position. And we also know its velocity exactly. So we just that's why I say we cheat. We're not allowed to have an exact position and velocity in real life, but we give them one for the purpose of simulation. And people have done studies trying to validate whether this actually works. And they're able to reproduce experimental things by doing simulations using this approach. They've been doing this for a few decades now, and society hasn't crashed yet, so I think it's working. That answer your question, hopefully. Yes. Other questions?
So that was the spring thing you were talking about,
Yes.
right? So that works for like alkanes, but alkenes just have like a double bond. The rotation doesn't work. So can you just like eliminate that one type of
In fact, the way that we do this for an alkene, so here's a alkene. Hard to see on the board because it's two-dimensional, but basically, if you were to rotate this like I did with the other one, you'd have the carbon here, and then hydrogen, hydrogen, and the one behind it is also hydrogen, hydrogen. So it's totally flat. This is handled 1, 2, 3, 4. So this is handled actually with the dihedral energy term. So maybe I should show what the function actually looks like when you plot it. So for the bond energy, this is just a parabola. So you have a plot on the y-axis would be energy, which we sometimes call U on the y, and then on the x-axis we would have the distance between the two particles that are bonded to each other. So as the distance reaches some point of equilibrium, this is the point of minimum energy. This is where it wants to be the most. Then the force of the bond, keeping it to that point, is at its minimum. Whereas the farther you deviate, the greater the energy, which is represented by the greater the force that you need to push it back to that position. So that's what the bond energy function looks like when you apply it. There's also what the angle energy function looks like. But instead of this, you have angle as your x-axis. But the dihedral energy for the ethane molecule, which is an sp3 orbital, I think, this looks like, I don't remember whether it's up or down first, but looks like a sine wave, like this. So the thing on the y-axis again is the energy of this dihedral, and then the thing on the x-axis is the angle of this twist right here. So there's some twist for the ethane that results in minimum energy. Some twist is going to be a staggered position. But then if you keep going, rotate again, then it becomes staggered just from a different perspective. So it goes up and down like this. Whereas for this one, function would look like same shape, lower period. So we could say, I don't know, is that actually the cutoff, but we could say that this is one 360-degree rotation, right? But this would be a 180-degree rotation. This is also 360. So we're going to make this look comfortable. Draw about 360 degrees right here, and then we have so the way that works out is, you could technically, you would need the force constant used in this equation is actually really large, because in real life we basically never see this thing go from this shape to this shape. You don't see that, but for the energy function, we would at least have it theoretically possible. But this point should have extremely high energy, and that's what it's bringing that happening. But if it continues going back down again, then the energy decreases, and that is because then other end of that, then it's like having the same shape again. but it is switched from cis to trans conformation or whatever. So the force constant is large enough that it shouldn't happen in an actual simulation, but this is something that you would actually want to watch for. It's an example of a simulation that has gone wrong, and the double bond has changed its conformation. But this is what the function looks like that tries to prevent this from happening. So the force constant that this thing is experiencing as it goes from here, it may deviate slightly. Okay. This is almost planar, but the force would very quickly push it back to being planar. So that's how we prevent that from happening. I can go all night if you guys have questions. Any more?
I have a question, I have a comment. Like, when you said modeling 1 liter of water would take 32 million billion bits, that's kind of crazy to me. And it kind of like, I don't know, makes you think long-term, future-wise, like what improvements can be made. Like, there's a lot of room for advancement.
Yes, and if I go back to this slide, there's a lot of research nowadays into, there's been a lot of research into this, but it's making more impressive things these days. So I sort of alluded to with your previous question, how you get around the whole quantum mechanical not having exact position and velocity thing. By saying that we perform quantum mechanical simulations or we perform experiments that probe these quantities that allow us to come up with a set of parameters for just like the values that we plug into this function that deals with the bond length and angle and dihedral angles to try and reproduce the behavior of this thing as closely as possible in order to create this level of model. Now people do this and they perform all atom simulations and try to come up with parameters for the next level up. So there's actually a very similar force function to the one that I showed that I've been talking about for the past 10 minutes, but that deals with these bigger particles representing larger groups of atoms. And then there's another level up from that. So they basically use each level of simulation to parameterize the next one up. And through this way, they hope that they can study really longer scale or bigger scale phenomena by just cheating more and more, and hoping that the estimations that they've made through the lower levels of simulation that are closer to reality can make up for the fact that they're cheating. Well, I'm hearing a lot more stuff. So anyone who wants to leave, or do you guys want to do like some sort of phase out and have some exit speech that you want to give, or should I just dismiss everybody?
Okay. There's no exit speech really, but thank you so much, Nathan, for joining us today. And everyone else, I guess, is free to go, or you can stay here forever. I don't know. But wait, really quick. So next Monday, we are having a networking strategies workshop at 5 p.m. Not here, but in the room across. So if you are available, please join us. And we are selling t-shirts also to raise money to support the local Bethlehem community. So if you're interested, there is a Google form in the email that Tracy sent this week, in all of them, I think. So check that out. And yeah, have a great rest of your week.
I should also advertise my professor's course that he teaches, where he actually goes into the longer explanation of how all this stuff works, and also works with you to actually build examples of these systems and actually simulate them on a cluster that we have that supercomputer cluster that we have on campus. So if you guys are interested in learning more about it, there's a course you can take next semester. And he knows what the course code is probably.
I was 237.
Yeah.
Or Chem 250.
But in any case, the course is probably called on whatever registration site, it's going to be called something like Introductory Biomolecular Modeling.
Steven's like, nope.
No, it's something along those lines.
Okay.
Or you can search my professor, Montalene.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Actually.
Thank you.
Bye, guys.
Uh,